Happy 4th. I'm waiting to see if everybody logs back on over on this link. I am so sorry about that. The link for me did not work. On the 4th of July, happy 4th of July, everybody. I'm going to see if you all can find the link here. Otherwise, I'm going to start the episode and hope that you can see me. And I can't see myself. So, let's see. Oh, wow. Super, super frustrating. Okay. Robin, you're there. Ryan, you're there. Okay. No idea. I am so sorry. Let's see if everybody else can find us. Carol, you're there. Okay. I just put the link, the new link, we'll have to disregard the old link, into our Facebook group, which is Rug Cooking and Punch Needle Club. But I see some people coming back, so that's great. Good. Okay. We will see. We will go slowly. We will ease into this episode. Judy, great to see you. Happy 4th. That was not a good way to start the episode. I can tell you, I am not good at these quick changes. That is for sure. Lisa, happy 4th. Happy 4th to everybody here in the U.S. Agenia, good morning. Great to see you. Okay, we're going to be all right. This is going to be fine. That was just a bit tricky. Heidi, hello. Hello again. Okay, good. Nada, Nancy, everybody's coming back. Kirsten, super. Great. I am so sorry about that. I have no idea what happened. But it's not happening now. So happy 4th of July, everybody. It seems so funny, Angela, good to see you, to go straight from Canada Day on our Friday night episode to Independence Day, the 4th of July here in the U.S. We've been celebrating a lot in the last few days, but it is exciting, isn't it? I'm so glad that this worked out. I feel sorry for people who got kind of caught in the tangle of that haven't crossed over to the next link. But this video will be available as soon as we're finished. It'll be available live. Hey, Doreen. So hopefully it works out. I put so much good content together. It was the better part of my day, the day before yesterday. Jane, good to see you. Thank you, Heidi. I'm feeling a bit like the 4th of July now. My heart has stopped pumping. I've got my watermelons on. For all you Canadians, hope your Canada Day weekend was marvelous. Absolutely. I hope your weekend is still marvelous. This is a long weekend for us here on Monday celebrating. I'm frantically looking for fireworks for the kids tonight. We had such a nice day yesterday. We went to a campground with some of our friends and used the pool and used hammocks and played in the arcade, and it was super fun. Played at the playground, and on the way home, it was about an hour and a half away, we must have seen pieces of about 20 different fireworks shows, just driving between two states and seeing fireworks popping up on both sides of the road. And I got saying to Joss, do you remember your favorite song? She's a grand old flag, she's a high flying flag. And it was like she'd never heard of the song before. We have to keep drilling these patriotic songs into the kids because they completely forget when the 4th of July rolls around that we had all these great songs to sing. Oh, thank you so much. I got them on Etsy, like all of my cute stuff. So, I put together a great episode, Patriotic USA episode. I am super patriotic. And it's funny because I was just chatting with my friend Rebecca White this morning. She's a great punch needle artist. And we were saying how the flag is like, for lots of reasons, and we know the reasons, but I'm not going to get into it. The flag is such a split thing right now. Some people are feeling it, some people are not feeling it, but I will tell you, I've got the flag out front. I'm super excited whenever there's a patriotic holiday. I know that this is not a great place for us to be in this country, but I still feel super patriotic, and I'm so proud of the origins, our roots, and where we came from, and I know we're going to get back there. Sooner rather than later. And I've been looking at all my patriotic books because I love reading about the history. I love reading about our break and our independence as a country. And that's what I'm digging into today, looking at some rugs that represent some of the most famous symbols for Americans, like the eagle, like not Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, like Paul Revere, like a lot of symbols that sort of harken back to 1776 and the War for Independence and all of that stuff that brings us to the 4th of July. And I want to show you some of the books that I found that I think were really fun before I get into our slideshow and we start looking at rugs. The 4th is kind of hectic for you since you have 2 dogs. Yeah. I was listening to that also, Lynn, on the radio. I was listening to people say things on the local station like, obviously you want to be thoughtful and careful about the dogs because this is so traumatic for them to hear all these explosions going off. But they also made a really good point that I hadn't thought of, saying if you live in an area where there's a lot of older people who might also be veterans, who might get a bad feeling when they hear something explode very close to them, that could be jarring and unsettling, and to just try to, check in with your elderly neighbors who you knew maybe fought in wars and had experiences that they don't want to get thrown back into on a special day. It's never good when there's loud explosions, really, really loud, close to your house, and you're not expecting them, right? For animals and people, that is super jarring. Whitney, happy 4th. Oh, are you still sick? Oh no, you don't want to go with your hubby to the parade. Oh, I'm so sorry. This is probably week 3. Oh, I'm so sorry. Grateful for our freedom, absolutely. And I'm so sorry that you're still sick. Hit or miss day, right? But, I've been doing reading for this episode for quite a while. I've been looking at this book, which is really cute. I'll look more at this. It's a textbook. It's not a rug hooking book. It's called The Bird, the Banner, and Uncle Sam. And it talks about the origins in folk art of symbols that are used to symbolize the U.S. and freedom and independence and all that stuff. And it really is a cute book with a lot of great folk art. And it tells you, why certain images, why certain symbols came to be and how. Like Uncle Sam too, right? That's a weird one. I have that for you in today's episode. So I was looking at that. I got a lot of ideas that I'm about to share. I was also looking at this book by Polly Minnick, American Summer. I know I've shown you this before in a video way at the beginning of this channel. We're going to have to look at this again. I thought maybe on Wednesday I would look at this book because this is, for me, the most sort of American patriotic book of rug hooking designs. And Polly Minnick is fantastic. So I'm going to use some of her images in today's episode, but I would like to spend more time on that book this week, or at least over the summer, because they are truly summer images. And it's like, we don't just use our patriotic symbols for just this day, right? When we get to the end of the summer, God forbid, because it's miles away, we're patriotic again with Labor Day, right? So we've got like 3 holidays where we're crazy with flags and the bunting and all that stuff. It's not just the one day, and it really should be year round, right? This is a great book too. I want to look at this on the show soon. All Flags Flying. This is a quilt book, but it's one of my favorite quilt books. American Patriotic Quilts as Expressions of Liberty. Robert Bishop and Carter Houck. Another really beautiful book for imagery, but these books got me going with how to put a show together today that would include lots of beautiful patriotic rugs, but also some commentary to talk about why these are our symbols, right? Not just we accept them on face value, but there's a reason why they're there. Heidi, coming from Belgium, it's so different getting a window into another culture, right? Joy, good to see you, and Courtney's with you too. Hello to both of you. The sisters are together for the holiday. That's so great. It's great to know what the symbols mean, right, Heidi? It's a lot of fun. So let me bring us to the 4th of July episode and see. I'm reading the thread as we go. Let me come down to, what did I put our first slide? Let's see. I did some Uncle Sam rugs first. So first let's look at a few Uncle Sam rugs, and then let's talk about, I wonder if anybody knows who Uncle Sam was, because this is a really interesting American story, ties into our history, really interesting. So in the meantime, we see a lot. This is a Sally Kellen design. I'm blanking out on her company name. Help me out. I always have it at the tip of my tongue. It'll come back to me because I'll use her later in the episode. Sally Kellen has a very famous rug hooking company. She's one of many people who do patriotic designs, and Uncle Sam designs are very popular. Just the idea of this character called Uncle Sam, this is kind of a big deal because there's always been this controversy about whether or not Uncle Sam is a real person. And he was a real person, and that whole history is interesting. Let's look at a couple more rugs, and then I'm going to walk you through it. He's based on a real person, as far as we know. That first one was a Sally Kellen design. This I found on Etsy by a company called Doodle Dog Primitives. I thought this was interesting because, oh, you're watching and punching too. Oh, Cindy and Jane are watching and punching. Oh, that's perfect. This is an interesting one because, especially for a holiday motif, this is hooked with wool strips, and then there's a little bit of the sort of roving or sheep curls, right? Used sort of in a proddy style, hooked right into Uncle Sam's beard. But in this case, the background is left bare. And that's kind of interesting because it gives you a quicker piece to make. It gives you an interesting background, a very focused picture in this set. Thank you, Rita. Pine Island Primitives for Sally Kellen. Pine Island Primitives. Thank you so much. It's always interesting to see pieces where the backing is not completely filled out. Now, sometimes this is hard with monk's cloth because a lot of the monk's cloth is gridded. And looking at monk's cloth, you are looking at something that looks more like a straight up backing material. But if you're using burlap and linen, you can do this effect because the background just looks like a nice piece of sacking, a nice piece of rustic linen. It's attractive all on its own. So again, this is a design from Doodle Dog Primitives on Etsy. They have a few designs in their store. This was the Uncle Sam, and I was searching specifically for Uncle Sam's. This is another Etsy store. This store is called Cyril, Syrl on Etsy, Cyril. And this is a finished rug, but the pattern is available on gridded paper. So that's the form this comes in. I just found this and thought, wow, this is really a very good version of Uncle Sam. I love this background and the golds, like the old golds, the bronzy golds, right? It looks like Cushing bronze green kind of a gold. Really nice in silhouette. There's some embedded stars in the hit or miss of that background that I thought was really, really effective. I love the solid striping on Uncle Sam, right? His flag is kind of waving a little bit. It's fluttering, but his hat and his pants have this very solid structural stripe to them. And that's really good in a design where the background is all mizzy-mazzy, hit or miss, with stars and stripies and wild coloring. And I also like how his body, instead of being done in a really electric kind of cobalt blue, it was done in a tweedy material with more stars. It's very subtle. It looks very antique. I thought this is just a really nice example of an Uncle Sam. And again, this is Cyril, Syrl. It's an Etsy store. And then I found this one, which is another really pretty one. This was anonymous. It came up on a site called Seek, SEEKPNG.com. That sounds ominous to me. That sounds like one of these wacky middleman, unofficial Pinterest kinds of sites where they're just grabbing content from other sites, but the link goes nowhere. It was a beautiful Uncle Sam. If anybody recognizes this, please put it into the comments. I would post this in our group with the information because an image like this, that's obviously a new image and possibly for sale, should not be like on its own hanging in internet space, right? In some weird limbo. SeekPNG.com. But a beautiful Uncle Sam with again the repetition of stars, right? The stars and the stripes, but it's really classic colors, denim border with the red stars, really bold hat, pants, flag, really lovely imagery. Let me see if there was one more. Yep, I think there's a few more Uncle Sams. This is a lovely one. This is a punch, miniature punch, which is sometimes called Russian punch. This is called Sam Celebrates, and this is by a company called Happy Cat Stitchery. So this comes available as a PDF pattern, and this is if you like to do the miniature punch, which is called Russian punch, right? It's the small little loops. Much smaller finished product, but really, really good design, and comes out very similar, not proportion-wise, but the finished product comes out really similar to a punch design. It's the same kind of thing, but with that much, much smaller tool, and you get the job done a lot faster too. Lisa Burbett is the artist behind Happy Cat Stitchery. You can see her name embedded into this piece, but she's got a lot of beautiful pieces. Happy Cat Stitchery. She's also on Etsy. I think she might also have a page. And I found this one as well that I thought was exceptional. This is on the cover of one of Polly Minnick's books. Polly Minnick has several books, and Patriotism is one of her, hello Alicia, happy 4th, is one of her big motifs, Polly Minnick, and that's M-I-N-I-C-K. So this is actually an Uncle Sam hat. I'm just reading what I wrote. Uncle Sam, okay, nope, that's a different one. This was on the cover of Polly Minnick's book. Let me show you the book, because if you're interested in other designs that are patriotic, This is another great book. This isn't the one I was holding up earlier. This is one of Polly's other ones, but I have this one as well. I think this one's in the studio, and you could probably tell I was at home. This is another true beauty, and again, filled with good content, very sort of conversational book, lots of bits of storytelling, but also lots of great patterns that you can use. And this is another one of Polly Minnick's books. She did this with Laurie Simpson, Victory Girls, and this is a combo of quilts and rugs. So another really great book to look at. These are all patriotic in their sort of thrust. So if you're looking for patriotic designs, you definitely want to look at these books of Polly Minnick's. And again, I'm going to cover the other one probably on Wednesday. Now, Uncle Sam is thought to be a really famous person. A known person in this story seems to be over history. I'm going to come back to him in a minute. You know, the thing with American history is that it's new, right? It's relatively very new. And our history in the U.S. is formed through storytelling, right? Which means it's oral history. It doesn't mean it's unreliable. It just means it's maybe not as reliable as history that was written from the same period in Europe, right? People come into the U.S. in the 17th, 18th centuries, very, very preoccupied. You know, imagine how ironic it must have felt to come to the U.S. for freedom. We won't even talk about the religious freedom part because we know that that did not happen, right? It happened in Rhode Island, but it didn't happen anywhere else in those early colonies. Roger Williams made it happen in Rhode Island, but people did not have religious freedom when they got here. A lot of people came for religious freedom, but a lot of people came because they really hoped that life would be a better quality for them. And whereas, like in Europe, you're coming from the Netherlands or England, places where they had sort of rations on wood that you could use. And as people were using wood to not only build their home, their business, their empire, but also to cook and to heat their homes, it was tough having sort of a ration, right, of something that you needed desperately. The thought of coming to the New World and having unlimited woods, unlimited space, unlimited resources must have been extremely tempting, tempting enough to take a ride of unknown length of time and unknown sort of safety elements to it, right, would have been terrifying for families and pregnant women and young children and everybody, men. Everybody would have been terrified, but it was worth doing for some people. So they made the leap and they crossed the water and they came here. And imagine how ironic and frustrating it must have been. I mean, they must have realized they would walk into a place that looked very similar to what they had left, but you know, a few saws, a few hand saws, all of these trees, all of the trees that one could want, but no mills, nothing built, no city centers, no village centers, nothing here. Um, Being able to look at all of that greatness and think, oh, we're going to be so warm, we're going to be so comfortable, we can build something so large for our family to live in, and then not being able to do it for quite a long time. And many people took to, in New England, living in caves, going back to that sort of way of life because of necessity. And it came about 100 years later. A lot of New England towns, this is like a little known fact of history, were putting bans on people living in caves because people just kept coming over, you know, over the decades, over a couple of centuries, lots of people coming and immigrating here. And so they were at all different levels of creating town centers, creating a village life, creating a community life. And a lot of people who were coming over were living in plantation situations. I'm not going to do history the whole time, which meant that they were funded by the government that they came from, right? Whether it was the Netherlands or it was the English crown, and they were meant to set up a community, a plantation that was also a viable business. And if that business failed, the crown would pull the plug on the business, right? If it's not making any money, there's no point. And those people would really be at a loss, right? Really be in trouble because they'd be here and there'd be no more funding coming in. So this was always a big deal. And this is the reason that so many places on the East Coast are called Jamestown, or one of the nicknames for Virginia, or the Virgin Queen, Elizabeth, right? A lot of places, town names named after monarchs because they hoped that they would be more reluctant to pull the plug on the business that was failing because it was hard to make it work. So it was very hard times, and a lot of people who were kind of striking out into different areas were signing contracts with local Native American tribes because warring among tribes was a very big deal. And there were a lot more powerful tribes around New England, like the Iroquois, who were just going, conquering one group to another group of other native people who were much smaller and maybe not as warring in their mentality. So contracts were being signed left and right that you could live on this land and you can share this river with us. But if we are attacked by a neighboring tribe or group or whatever, or England or France or whoever the enemy was at that moment, you would be fighting on their side. And people did. I mean, people died fighting as soon as they got here because of there were so many wars happening already between the native people. So there was a lot happening. Life was extremely dangerous. It wasn't cut and dry the way that history books wrote it when I was growing up. It's also not as cut and dry, I think, as people would like to have it on the internet when they talk about all the patriotic, pardon my French, bastards, right? We get this a lot on Facebook. It's not quite that cut and dry. There was a lot going on politically, and dynamics were very different from one community to another community. As people got things going and got building and got their lives going, there kept being wars, right? There kept being fighting. There was always this threat that England would want to fight for the land, which we eventually fought for and won in 1776. But until that time, it's also important to remember, supporting the British point of view at this time, that they had been supporting many of these colonies financially for over a century, right? And in supporting these colonies, they had been paying essentially frontier bodyguards who were British, who lived here and would fight and would defend and were here for the colonies to protect the investment that the crown had made. So to be fair to the English, by the time the Revolutionary War breaks out, and I am wrapping this up, there were a lot of British people living here for many generations who generations back had married American women because they were soldiers that had been living here for all of their lives. And you have to wonder, when push came to shove, right, in 1775, when all of this fighting is happening all around Boston and Concord and Lexington, I have to wonder, how hard did some of these British soldiers fight? New British soldiers were brought in to fight the war, but there were already a lot of soldiers here who had been here for their whole lives. And you have to think about how torn they must have felt suddenly being given the order that they live in this town, but now they're supposed to fight those guys who have always been their friends and neighbors, possibly family members. I mean, it was a tough situation at this point. But as with everything in life, both sides had a very good point, and England had made a huge financial investment in what became New England, right? So they had a very viable point too. They wanted to tax us for things that we'd already been enjoying for a century. So that's a tough conversation, and that's the part of it that people don't often like to talk about. So that brings us to Uncle Sam, and this is a tricky time because at this point we are heading into the Revolutionary War. And this is the history of this person called Uncle Sam, right? I'm going to back up for a minute. Sam is born in, his real name, his full name is Sam, wait a minute, Wilson. So he's born in Arlington, Massachusetts, which was known as Monotony at the time. That has changed names since. And it was a township. It was like near Cambridge, right outside Boston. So at the age of 15, Sam joined the Continental Army. And on March 2nd, this was on March 2nd, 1781, his duties, like everybody had different jobs. Just because you joined didn't mean that you were fighting, right? If there was no fighting going on at that time, you would do something else, right, for the army. And his special job at this very young age was caring for cattle and mending fences and slaughtering and packing meat. So he was essentially a meat packer, right? While things were quiet, this was his specialty. This is what he learned to do prior to the war, prior to the fighting. So his job, as the unrest kind of built, right, and more British soldiers are being brought in after the Boston Tea Party, his job was, meat was really important, right, because it's going to feed. The army will make a contract with a certain meat sort of distributor in every region to make sure that those thousands of soldiers are fed and sustained so that they can live and fight, but mostly live, of course. And tampering with meat is a very big deal. So there's a lot of people who are involved in the cattle part of supplying the food, because there have to be people in place like Sam just to be sure that the meat is not poisoned, because that would be a great military tactic to kill everybody at a base without fighting by tampering with their meat. So these are all things that he did during this time leading up to the Revolutionary War. And by the time we get to, wait a minute, the War of, hold on, Wilson was appointed meat inspector for the American Army. He worked for a company called Anderson at E.S. Wilson. Anderson was linked to Wilson. They were contracted by the Army to provide like 2,000 barrels of pork, 3,000 barrels of beef every year for staff and 200 men who were like positioned at a certain fort in a certain region. And that was their full-time job, and they got paid for that. So everybody knew who Sam Wilson was already because he'd been there for years and his business was right there, slaughtering cattle and getting meat ready and providing meat, right? So people already knew who he was. But by the time more soldiers were kind of filling in, things were ramping up. They were checking the meat and packing it in barrels and shipping it to soldiers on a much more often basis. And during that time, all of the barrels had to be stamped to show that someone had inspected it and make sure the meat wasn't tampered with. And this is Sam's job. So each barrel was marked EA for Elbert Anderson, who's like the sister company to the Wilson Company, which is Sam Wilson, his business. Everything was stamped EA US. And the reason for the US was because everybody referred to Sam locally as Uncle Sam, right? All the troops knew him already as Uncle Sam, and he was a friend. So first they were stamping the barrels EA for the other company US, and then in a hurry they just started stamping them US. And they knew it was Uncle Sam, but other people seeing the barrels who didn't know Sam, who were new to the area, were thinking US Uncle Sam, right? You get it, the US with both. And as time went on and the United States became called the United States and known as the United States, everything went back to that US Uncle Sam thing. It was in a lot of people's memories still. So he, like by default, became a symbol, US, on those barrels for all of those thousands of soldiers. US and Uncle Sam became like the same thing. So it's just a coincidence the way the letters worked out. But he is considered to be the genesis of the expression Uncle Sam, and it's just language confusion on stamped barrels of meat during those war years. So I thought that was interesting. This is actually Uncle Sam himself, and it just goes to show how funny it is when something can get confused like that along the way, right? The Uncle Sam on Seek PNG, Ryan said, looks to be the Woolly Fox version. Okay, that's excellent. Cats Gallery, Southern Soil, great to see you. Let's look at that one more time because that sounds good. Let's look at the Lost Seek PNG, right? We just don't like things like that, do we? Let me come back here. Wait a minute. Is that it? No, that's the Happy Cat Stitchery. Let's look at one more time. Still struggling with this program. Seek. There we go. So that, Ryan says, this looks like the Uncle Sam that is on the Woolly Fox website. I would totally go along with that. It looks absolutely like that style. So that would be good. Thank you for checking on that. I really appreciate it. It's so hard, all this silliness, right? So Uncle Sam, and that brings us to... Oh, so, it's worth saying in this conversation about Uncle Sam, this whole U.S. Uncle Sam, United States thing got confused. Uncle Sam is kind of the male figure that is supposed to personify the United States, but the female counterpart is like Lady Liberty, also known as Columbia, right? Which is like an interchangeable word with America. So we get Columbia or Lady Liberty on a lot of art propaganda. It's often one or the other. Rarely do we see them together, right? So they're two different sort of metaphorical allegory figures that represent the United States. And this is an example of, let me figure out which one this is, Old Tattered Flag. This is an old tattered flag image that I found on Pinterest. But I thought it was really beautiful. So whereas we just saw lots of Uncle Sams, there's also a bunch of Lady Liberty / Columbias. I thought this one was the most astonishing one. This is by Pat Mericalio, Mericalio. This is an extraordinary Lady Liberty, kind of a reference to the Statue of Liberty, right, like on Liberty Island, but very colorful, more alive, right? This is a true like Columbia figure. But this is an amazing piece that has firecrackers going on all over. And she's really uniting the new with the old with this extraordinary skyscraper border. Almost has a 1950s feel, right? Like a jazz album cover, these dark blues. But I love how it breaks the borders with the firecrackers that are zinging up. But I just thought this is an astonishing and amazing example of a Lady Liberty pattern. I thought it was just beautiful. And I think I have, this is the one that I just did that I'm still working on, Stars and Stripes and Watermelons. That's like a Lady Liberty figure as well. That was one that I did with the watermelon border. So that one is out now in Ribbon Candy Hooking. And then I moved to, you know, I have to say, wait a minute, let me do this. This Pat Maracalio image was on a Jean Shepherd blog. So the blog link didn't open for me. The page kept not coming up. I don't know if it was like a permanent problem, but I just wanted to let you know you can Google this image because Pat Maracalio's got some amazing work on that's on the internet. But this was on Jean Shepherd's rug hooking blog. It was under Blog Archive Private Collection Part 1. And I could see that the link was there, but it was just not coming on. Fernande, good to see you. Happy 4th, Carol. Good to see you, my buddy. So, Lady Liberty, Uncle Sam brings us to George Washington. We know for sure that he's a real person, obviously. Plantation owner who served as general and commander-in-chief, first president, but the man who refused the offer to also be the king. Showed his good character for sure. He was a leader of the colonial armies, of course, during the American Revolutionary War. And, you know, it is a big deal. It's still a big deal to me that we were just a bunch of colonies filled with these guys who are mustering for a good long time, right? In different areas, people mustering for different lengths of time. The further north you go, the more loyalists you get who are loyal to the crown. But in different areas where there was more or less unrest, people were more tuned into the possibility of impending trouble, right? More in the communication loop than others. So, I mean, it's just remarkable to me that at this time in history, these guys who had just been mustering on the village green, very informal, come together, fought and beat the largest and strongest army in the world. I'm super proud of that. I will always be super proud of that. It shows such a strong will, right? And again, for me, it always comes back to that sad question of how hard were some of the British soldiers fighting? You know, the ones who'd been living here and the ones who'd just recently been sent here. It must have just been an awful situation. War is an awful situation all around. Beautiful George Washington rugs that are always available year-round and ever popular. Some of the ones that I found, this is a really... this is an old one. I would call this an early 20th century one. I wouldn't call this a 19th century one, but a very cartoony one. I don't recognize this pattern. I think this might be a one-off sitting under his cherry tree. This was on Invaluable, and I don't belong to Invaluable, so I couldn't really get any further with it, but it's sold in November of 2020 on Invaluable. So I'm not sure what that sold for. It is in rough condition, but it is a lovely image. I know that this one came up on Morphy, Morphy auctions. George Washington on his horse. It says Father of the Country. It didn't say it in the Morphy auction listing. What it said was hooked rug with George Washington on horse, colorful George Washington on a horse with banner underneath, Father of his Country, stage curtains on each side, 35 by 48, condition very good. Price estimate on that was $1,000 to $1,500. I'm not sure if that's still for sale or if that's sold. I'm pretty sure that this is a Hutchinson rug. I am sure that this is a Hutchinson rug. So Mercedes and James Hutchinson, they did a lot of patriotic rugs, and I recognize this one. So I'm surprised that the auction house wouldn't have caught this and been able to put a name on it. It might be that it is a copy, but it's certainly old and faded, right? It's not a 21st century copy because people, I think Janet Connor sells Hutchinson rugs now. They are, the images are old enough that the Hutchinsons have both been dead for more than 70 years. So people can make copies of these rugs, but this is clearly not a copy. This is an older rug, and if this is indeed a Hutchinson, it would be worth a lot more than $1,000 to $500. But, you know, sometimes people putting these auctions together are not doing a heck of a lot of research, and it would behoove them, I think, to do a lot of research. This is a new rug that appeared on Nazmial, so Nazmiyal, that's a tough one, antiquerugs.com. Under their category of vintage rugs, they tend to sell Eastern/Oriental rugs, but this is one of the few hooked rugs that they have. I think this is on there currently for sale. And the entry just says, full of history and whimsy, this vintage American hooked rug features a charming, stylized portrait of General George Washington riding his iconic white horse. So no more information, but there must be, again, in the thread, for those of you, Chrissy, happy 4th. For those of you who are more knowledgeable and have more sort of mental capacity than I do, if you recognize this pattern, please put it in the thread like you just did with the woolly fox and supplying the Pine Island primitives. If you recognize it, let me know, because I don't think it's a one-off. I think it's a commercial pattern. But the people who are selling this, the Nazmia or Nazmialantiquerugs.com, are more knowledgeable about sort of woven Eastern style rugs than American primitive hooked rugs. So there's no further information on their site, and that's where I got this image. I thought it was a lovely image, but I would love to learn more about it as well. Here's another lovely image of a Washington hooked piece. This is a 3-dimensional pillow. This was on the Pinterest page of Kathy Meyer, Meyer. So I'm not sure if she's the artist, but she uploaded this image and I couldn't resist it. It didn't go anywhere else, but I just thought it was beautiful. It's almost like a bolster pillow, very, very sort of dour or door expression on his face, right? This is often how he looked. People say he didn't smile because of all the pain and trouble with his teeth. It's also said that the fact that he had hippopotamus teeth is not true. His teeth are at Mount Vernon, right, where you can tour, and they say not hippopotamus. I think they're ivory or something like that. But he didn't smile a lot because it hurt. He must have been in pain often. I think this is a beautiful, beautiful piece. I found one on Amy Oxford's site too, a punch pattern. I thought this is so charming. This is so charming with the sort of red, white, and blue flags in the background. George Washington on his horse, right? During the Revolutionary Wars, while these small battles were being fought and eventually shot heard around the world, Lexington and Concord, right? That whole day that unfolded. We'll talk about that in Paul Revere's Ride in a little while because I have a Paul Revere rug to show you. During this time, we did not have, and this is important. Oh, that's okay, Mom. We had a fiasco with the first link. It's worth just remembering and reminding ourselves that we didn't have a national identity during the 1770s, right? We hadn't established ourselves yet. We were absolutely a melting pot of a lot of people from a lot of places. But we had no flag, of course. We weren't a country, we weren't united. We were 13 colonies, right? So we'll talk about this a little bit in the flag segment, but it's worth noting that everything that is truly from this period, the late 18th century, the fighting years, all of the symbols and things that we see are not yet part of the American identity. That will be formed and that will be decided a little bit later when we have won the war and we are independent and we can say that we are our own place. I think this rug really reflects that moment in time. Washington on his horse, very stylized. I like the red, white, and blue flags in the background. The flag hasn't been established yet. I think this is a beautiful punch pattern. And again, this is available on Amy Oxford's site, like all of her beautiful patterns. Let me bring you back down. I think I have one more. Let's see. Oh, this is a beauty. This was on a page called wait a minute, primitive. I think this was, wait a minute. Oh, Pinterest. This was on Pinterest. It was on Pinterest, and the site that I wasn't able to connect to, the former link was antiquetrader.com. And it didn't say anything about the specific rug. It was just a photo posted for atmosphere, a super atmospheric poster rug with the egg basket and the folk figure, right? I thought it was really charming, but it didn't have a better source than antiquetrader.com. It is a lovely rug. It looks like a Hutchinson rug again to me with the apple tree down below. It really looks, it looks like it's been mounted, right, on something behind it. But it really looks like a Hutchinson rug for me again. Hard to know at this distance and without further information, but I thought it was a beautiful vignette and worth showing. This is a rug we've seen before. We have certainly seen this rug before. I don't know that this is the same because I know that there are copies of this rug out there, but this appeared on Bid Square, the website called Bid Square. It's an online auction site. The estimate on this rug was 4,000 to 8,000. So this listing was inscribed with General Washington, noblest of men, his house, his horse, his cherry tree, and him. Um, Dimensions 30.5 by 53, provenance private collection. And I'm fast forwarding Old Hope Antiques. Now, Old Hope Antiques, I know from my research, picked up a lot of the Barbara Johnson rugs. And sure enough, she appears further down in the provenance of this piece. It's a long list of provenance. So what we know is that it sold in 2014. Lot 192 sold for 32,400. I can't verify that number at all. That information I could not find currently online. I didn't want to spend hours on it. But it was in the collection, certainly, of Barbara Johnson, because we looked at it together during our Barbara Johnson episode. I don't know what the current state of affairs is in terms of whether this sold on Bid Square for between 4,000 and 8,000. I don't belong to that site either. But we know that Barbara Johnson owned it between 1998 and 1999, and then it changed hands or went up for auction. So unknown. Interesting, though, because, again, there are copies of it. So for me, a rug like this, especially in an online auction, is a hard one to put that kind of a value on, because the question is, are you looking at the original, and how much do we know of the original? So Nada, this is great information you're giving us. You have a rendition of this rug done by Claire Murray in Punch. That is very good to know. Is it punch, Nada, or is it hooked with yarn? Doesn't really matter one way or the other. Claire Murray usually does her hooking with yarn, and I wouldn't be surprised because Claire Murray did use a lot of rug patterns that were in the Barbara Johnson collection. I realized when we did our Barbara Johnson episode a few weeks back that I recognized a lot of them also from Claire Murray. So that doesn't surprise me at all. A rug like this, the image would be in the public domain because of the age of the original rug. So again, begs the question, is this the original of the pattern? Is this the first? Or could this be one of the ones that have been done since as recently as Claire Murray era? So that poses all kinds of different questions, but you definitely, moral to the story, you want to know what you're bidding on if you're bidding in the thousands. You want to be pretty sure. People sometimes pull provenance off the internet because they see all these links and they see the rug and they go, that looks like a similar rug. This happens on eBay all the time. This happened with a Hutchinson rug recently that somebody said, this is an original Hutchinson. It was obviously not. Obviously not. It was made like a week ago. So you have to be really careful about this because sometimes the sellers just don't know. And it's easy to get swept away and to put big bids in that are in the thousands. But I think it would be a lot harder to get your money back, even if you were to find out without a doubt that it's not an original. So easier to do the research before you put those big bids on. This is a beautiful piece too by my friend Pat at the White Cat, right? The rug cooking store in Cape Cod. I talk about her all the time, but this is one of her designs, and this is her version of a George Washington rug. I just love it. So Pat from the White Cat did this one. Let me see if I have any other George Washingtons. There's always a lot, right? As there should be. Father of our country. This is not a George Washington. I accidentally put this in here. I got excited when I saw it, but I wanted to keep it in there. I could have shifted it, but I didn't. I found this on a site called AmericanInsights.org. AmericanInsights.org. This is a hooked rug, unknown maker, Pennsylvania between 1800 and 1900, all wool, 47, almost 48 by 36, bequest of the Winterthur Museum. So Henry Francis DuPont, right? So this was one of the rugs in his collection. We know that he's a great hooked rug collector and picked the top rugs, right? Because he could afford them. So this was one that was in his collection. Maybe still at the Winterthur Museum, but I just thought it's such a beautiful rug. This is one of these rugs that the border has been done in quarters. If you were to fold your page in quarters and draw that corner, you would have the full border, but the central motif is done in halves. So it's just a horse that's kind of been traced or done with a stencil facing the other horse, very much in the tradition of Magdalena, right? Also from Pennsylvania, definitely not a Magdalena, but a lot of hit or miss, and using the same techniques that people were, thank you, Mom, were using at that time. So Nada says yarn hooking on heavy burlap. Oh, that is the Claire Murray formula, and her burlap is super sturdy. I have a few pieces that I bought, Claire Murray pieces that are partly done, and I am working on finishing them, and they are on heavy burlap, and I'm going to finish them on burlap, just not at this moment with practically no time. But they are beautiful and very durable. I'm making an argument for sometimes burlap, especially if it's 90% made, right? But I really loved this piece. Again, AmericanInsights.org has a lot of good historical information and a lot on the Winterthur Museum. And I think I might even have, let me just check. It's fun to find these old designs because you know that this is copyright free public domain. And if you like this design, you figure out a way to print it, enlarge it, and do it, right? Father of his country. So this is another one that fits for me into the Hutchinson genre. And this was a Skinner auction, and the link is dead. So it doesn't say anything further other than Skinner put it up. I'm hoping that since Skinner put it up that they would have said that this is a Hutchinson rug, because I feel that it must be, just in terms of the blocking and the shading in the background and the cartoon figure, right? It just looks 100% Hutchinson. I want to do more episodes on the Hutchinsons and explore a little bit more what their style was and what their sort of categories of interest were, because there's tons of rugs on divorce, on in-laws, on patriotism, on philanderers, on bawdy ladies, like lots of comedy rugs. And these patriotic rugs, there's quite a few of them, have sort of an uncomfortable place in that collection of subjects. But we should do a special focus soon on the Hutchinsons, where we talk about the different subjects for their rugs. Now, I don't know if you remember, thanks Sharon, I don't know if you remember this rug. I think it popped up on the Facebook group called, I think it was Willie Mason Jar. This is such a beautiful rug made by Melissa McKay, M-C-C-A-Y, in 2020. I was watching, as I had just started ribbon candy hooking in January, and I was watching in those early months her evolving this rug. I had such a special interest in it because I love the story of Paul Revere. And I love the Longfellow poem. You know, this has got to be, at least for Americans, it is known as the most famous two lines of American poetry. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. That's something that most American people know. It's considered the two most famous lines of an American poem by Longfellow. And I love this story of Paul Revere because, let me just come to my notes on Paul Revere. When I was a tour guide, which was, you know, my job before I had kids, and I didn't go back to being a tour guide because it's just too impossible to do when you've got little ones. But I used to love going into Boston with my tour groups once a week, and we would stand, maybe I've made a picture of it for you. I'm going to click back to this picture for sure because I want to look at this in great detail. We used to stand, let's see, I think right here at this statue. That's it. So there's the Old North Church in the background, and there's the statue of Paul Revere. He's actually writing in the wrong direction. I used to stand right against this statue every week for 3 seasons of the year and talk to a different group of 55 people every week who came on the bus and were just arriving in Boston. It was their first morning with me on an 8-day tour, and it was such a lot of fun to be able to take them through the Freedom Trail in Boston. The Freedom Trail is literally a painted stripe on the pavement that connects many of the events of the American Revolution. It takes you right down to the USS Constitution. You know, it links a lot of the events. But this moment on the Freedom Trail shows Paul Revere riding on Black Beauty, which was a borrowed horse, right? This is a horse he did not have time to ask permission to borrow, right? So he kind of nicked a horse and took off on this crazy midnight ride. Thanks, Susie. In this picture, in For Eternity, I guess, the statue is not pointing toward the Old North Church, which it should, because if you remember in the Longfellow poem, he was looking for a symbol from the Old North Church, one if by land, two if by sea. If it was one lantern shining, it was by land. If it was 2 lantern shinings, then the British were going by sea. They really needed to know because they didn't want to run into them. They wanted to run around them. And they wanted to warn everybody in all of the towns neighboring that the fighting was about to happen. So they had to wake people up in the middle of the night. So this was a big moment in history. But what's interesting about this statue is that the reason it is the wrong way around is because if you were looking at this statue the way that it is right here, your back would be to the church where Rose Kennedy grew up, and that's like her local church in her neighborhood. And they, as a family, the Kennedys were pretty powerful in Boston, as you can imagine, did not want the church as a congregation, did not want the rear end of a horse pointing at the church. It's right pointing at the church. The church is immediately behind the street here. So it's turned the right way, right? And understandably, it just gives you a feel for Paul Revere. It's worth saying that this whole story about one if by land, two if by sea, I'm going to go off on a bender for a minute, and I'm probably going to split this episode into two because we're coming right up to an hour, and I don't want to cut it short. So I'll probably come back to you on Wednesday, concluding the Independence Day episode. But it's so interesting to note these behind the scenes stories, right? A couple of things about this night that we never talk about. We always talk about Paul Revere, but there were tons of people out on this evening, with more British soldiers arriving in Boston constantly. Sam Adams at his pub with the Sons of Liberty, of which Paul Revere and many of the founding fathers were going to find out the news, right? Find out what was going on and where they needed to go and where the fighting was going to happen and who was coming in and what was going on, right? All of the communication that needed to happen was happening at Sam Adams Tavern. That's Sam Adams of the beer, right? So that's all happening around Boston. There's a lot of agitators in Boston with a lot of money, and that's why Boston, because there's a lot of agitators like John Hancock with a lot of money, and John Hancock alone, a lot of people say, fund the revolution with his cash. Somebody has to do it. So people are gathering, and on this particular night of Paul Revere's ride, there are tons of people all over the city after curfew, because the British imposed a curfew. They want no nonsense at night. They want people to not be able to be mobile. They want to take them by surprise when the fighting begins. But there are a lot of men out after curfew, tons of them, right? They're all doing different jobs. Now, Paul Revere, his job is to look at the Old North Church steeple and figure out if the British are coming by land or sea. He's got one job out of so many people. There are two other riders on the same night that make the same ride as him that we never talk about. One of them is called Samuel Prescott, and he's the only one who makes it to Concord and Lexington, to both, to Lexington and then Concord. Forget who the name of the third one was. Isn't that awful? Because we don't talk about him. But Samuel Prescott, Paul Revere did not make it, right? He's one that did not make it, but Samuel Prescott did. And the second guy didn't make it too. He got kind of caught and stuck. The British found him, and he wormed his way out of it, hiding in a vacant barn. There was a lot going on that night. But I think one of the people who we never talk about, who is a huge hero in this, is the sexton of the Old North Church, whose name was, wait a minute. Oh, it'll come to me. It'll come right to me. Robert Newman, who was a super young man who worked at the Old North Church. His job was being the sexton of the Old North Church. He had to go up into the steeple of the church with lanterns after curfew. Now, what are the chances and what risk was involved in shining lights after curfew, which obviously are signals, not like, oops, I flashed my high beam, sorry. He's making a signal. If he's caught, he will be killed, like 100%. So, and he's trapped in the tower. And the British did see the signal of the lanterns, right? They saw the lanterns being shown, and they knew it was a signal, and they tried to catch him. And he literally bust through a window of the church into a back alley. He was a very young man living with his mom, and he made his escape. So there were a lot of people out this night who were working for the same end. But Paul Revere is the one that we remember. And the reason we remember Paul Revere, you're probably ahead of me with this, is because of the Longfellow poem. And this is another interesting story. I'm going to just do this. We're going to look at the rug, and then we'll stop for today. That Longfellow poem by our sort of national poet laureate, right, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, he was trying to write a poem as we were heading almost inevitably toward the Civil War. Everybody wanted to create a piece of propaganda, right, in anticipation of another war that would evoke patriotism and brave, strong feeling, like patriotic feeling. And the word was put out by newspapers. There's going to be a contest for a poem that will become the poem that will print all over the place, that's meant to work as propaganda to get people feeling the right way, knowing that we are inevitably on the brink of another war, and it will be the Civil War. And Longfellow, he wants to be the person who writes this poem that becomes very, very famous and is printed all over the place. A lot of people do. Longfellow's only one of them. So Longfellow is sitting there racking his brain thinking, who can be the subject and the hero of this poem that I'm going to write? It's going to be a narrative poem. That's what they wanted. Who can be the subject of it? Because when you think about it, this is a terrible subject, but it's true, and it doesn't serve any purpose to ignore it. But all of the founding fathers were involved with slavery, and it's just the way that it was at that time. For example, we were just looking at, I'm not justifying or saying anything about it is okay, obviously. I'm not saying that at all, but it's worth saying that even George Washington, the father of the company, I'm not putting him down at all. This is the way life was at the time. He's a Virginia plantation owner. He, at the age of 11, started to inherit enslaved people. He inherited 10 enslaved people when his father died through that will. And over the course of his lifetime, Washington will inherit, purchase, rent, and gain control of 577 enslaved people, as will just about every founding father that you can name, because that was the culture at the time. We're not making judgments about it. We're just saying that is a historical fact. So the thing about Washington was, and I have to say, this makes a big deal because we love Washington. We want to continue to love him. We don't want to hate him because of this part of his story. But he depended on that labor to build and maintain the family plantation, right, that he was born into. As a young man, Washington accepted slavery, but after the Revolutionary War, he began to question it. Washington avoided the issue publicly, believing that bitter debates over slavery could tear apart the fragile nation. I think he was right, because another 70, 80 years and we're at the beginning of the Civil War. So he was absolutely right about that. But he made his most telling and powerful anti-slavery statement after his death in his will, when he ordered that his enslaved workers would be freed at his wife's death. So maybe it seems like not, it definitely seems like not enough to us in this day and age without modern sensibilities, but at that time, he certainly didn't have to do that. So everybody that was in bondage at Mount Vernon got to go and start a life, right? And that brings us to the Civil War in this era, which, these are just difficult things to talk about. Thanks, Jane. So coming back to Longfellow, when he's writing his famous poem, he's thinking, what hero can I use? Because everybody he's turning up has ties to slavery. And the core problem and issue approaching the Civil War is slavery. So this is not appropriate. So he stumbles upon, he just hears about, somebody tells him a story about this person called Paul Revere. This is part of the oral storytelling that makes up American history. Some of it's going to be true, some of it's not. These are stories that sometimes turn into tall tales. Storytelling happened. He caught wind of somebody called Paul Revere. He came to Boston, did a bit of research on Paul Revere. He found out that he had a shop, right, that's now on part of the Freedom Trail. He was a metalsmith. He did a lot of things, but he was a metalsmith. He had a family. He was a father. There was a big story there about this ride in the middle of the night. So he caught as much of that as he could, pre-internet days. He caught as much of that story in the ride out to Boston and the lanterns in the window. He caught as much of that through what was left of the oral storytelling. And he wrote this famous poem that becomes known as the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere that's well worth reading. It's a real tearjerker. Oh, look at Patriotic Pup. Patriotic Pup comes to see us on 4th of July. Little Buttons comes to say hi. So that's the genesis of that poem and that story. And it's so worth reading more about that evening because it's very exciting. But the way that narrative poetry went in those days was you would pick one person to be the hero, and it was Paul Revere. And my point is not to take anything away from brave Paul Revere, but there was lots of people doing a lot of brave things that evening, and he was just one of many. It takes a village, right? So coming back to this image that I think is absolutely stellar, not this one. Wait a minute. See, I had so much content for you today, it was ridiculous. And that goof at the beginning did nothing for my nerves. So let me get rid of this and bring you back here. And I just want to show you, the sort of evolution of this piece as Melissa McKay was working on it. She started with this drawing here. And I remember the conversation as she was evolving this. This is called, what was this called? The Midnight Ride. I think she called this the Midnight Ride. I had a hell of a time trying to find this image from 2020. on Facebook. It was just not coming up anywhere. And then I was doing Paul Revere, I was doing Patriotic, I was doing One If by Land. And then I thought, oh, you know what? On the off chance, maybe it's called Midnight Ride, and it was. And I was honestly searching for this image for about 45 minutes, this rug, because I needed to know who did it if I was going to show it. So I remember in this conversation on the thread, and I'm not sure the thread is entirely still there, but she was really struggling. She drew this. In the middle, that church, of course, is the North Church, and in that top of the tower, that belfry, is where Robert Newman would have been holding up the lanterns for One If by Land, Two If by Sea. And on the left is Paul Revere's house. Now, in terms of geography, those things are not next to each other. They're a walk away. They're several blocks away, but they're not next to each other. But it makes a lot of sense in this composition to put them together. And there's Paul Revere riding. Look at his horse. It's not his horse. It's Black Beauty. It's a friend of his horse. Can I borrow it? Yes. Wasn't planning on you taking it hours away in the middle of the night and getting in all this trouble. At the end of the day, it's also interesting to note that Black Beauty, his friend's horse who he borrowed and promised to bring back, he goes on this crazy midnight ride, and he was stopped by the British because he didn't make it all the way, and Black Beauty was confiscated by the British. So this is again part of the story of this, and it's all oral history. But as the story goes, when the British stopped Paul Revere, they said, "Listen, this is really bad what you're up to. You know, people die for this all the time, all day long. People die for this. We bring them to the Boston Common and we string them up, and they're hung that way. And on the off chance that you don't hang on the first, drop of the stage doors underneath your feet, people come up and pull your leg instead of having you wiggle there for hours." That's the genesis of the phrase, "you're pulling my leg," comes from like the Boston Common and these hangings. And they said to Paul Revere, as the story goes, "This isn't going to be good for you, but that is a nice horse. If you were to, for example, give up this horse and give it to us, we might be inclined to let you walk this off and just find your way, and we'll leave you alone." And he said, "Here's the horse." And of course, it wasn't his horse, but he gave it to the British, and he was able to walk off through the woods, which I'm sure he probably did rather quickly, until he could find his bearings and get somewhere where he could be safe again. But it was just, I'm sure, a very stressful night. So Melissa's got lots of elements in this piece of the story that for her are the most important. Now, if you're telling the same story, you see how she ends up filling in that red brick, right, for the Old North Church. And on the left, Paul Revere's house. I mean, it's just lovely. You see the harbor in the background, the boats in the background. There is water in the background because, right, in Boston, both the Mystic and the Charles River meet. And for those of you who know Boston, you probably know that whole area that's now like Quincy Market, that's landfill. That's centuries old landfill. They had to shore up part of the city like way back when in these days. So we're getting a different geography. It's not entirely incorrect because the water was in a different place in these days, but these two buildings are not together. You see the light on in Paul Revere's house. There wouldn't have been a light on really because of the curfew. I mean, you would not want British soldiers knocking on your house because you had a lamp going. The stakes were much too high, but you can see how much work she put into this beautiful piece. Reminded me of this is a painting, but you know the artist Grant Wood? This is Grant Wood's Midnight Ride, right? Famous 20th century artist. And you see Paul Revere. This is super stylized. This does not look like this at all, right? Boston is not a village, right? It's all cobbled and dirt and stuff in these days. It's not going to be grassy green like this. A lot of the buildings that are present date to this period. But this is a beautiful stylized view of Paul Revere riding. This might not be Boston, actually. This might be one of the other village greens that he's riding through. Super stylized, but really lovely. And you can see the whole point is that as Paul Revere rides, people always yell, say he's yelling, "The British are coming, the British are coming." They're saying he would never be yelling. Historians say he would never be yelling, "The British were coming," because they were all British. They were all British men with British accents, some having arrived recently, some a generation ago. But they weren't the British and the Americans yet. They definitely wouldn't have been yelling that. It's not clear at all what he's yelling. A lot of history books say different things. But the point is he's raising the alarm as he rides, not stopping, just shouting as he goes, trying to elicit the attention of specific people who are muster leaders or kingpins in different villages. these are local guys who know their way through these villages. He's trying to wake up all the men so that they grab their musket and their homemade uniforms, and they are going to make their way to the Lexington Green, where they're going to hit their first kind of wall of fighting with the British. And then the fighting will move to, and we'll probably talk about this when we pick the conversation up again on Wednesday and conclude this episode. They'll make their way to Concord, which is the town that I love. I think one of my favorite towns in the world. We go there all the time. But they'll start having their fighting in Concord. And then the next great misunderstanding is going to happen when the British soldiers are coming across the field through the town, and all the farmers out in their fields who haven't gotten word look at the town and see smoke coming off of it and start shouting they're burning the town down. And really what had happened was the British soldiers had collected from the people who they'd caught, like all of the weapons. They'd found the storehouse for the weapons, and they were burning their weapons. And what they were seeing were like all the munitions being burnt, not the town being burnt, but it started some furious fighting, as you can imagine, while the farmers are in the fields thinking that their houses are being burnt down. That started the next furious wave of fighting. And this is all in the same 24-hour period, which is amazingly exciting. What an exciting day. And it ended with 4th of July, right? Our celebration on the 4th of July. That's the signing of documents, not the fighting day. But it's all interesting. It all ties up. I just don't want to keep you all day long. We did a couple of pages worth, but we have a few more subjects to go through on Wednesday. We looked at George Washington, but I want to look at the symbol of the bald eagle, and lots of hooked rugs feature the symbol of the bald eagle. I have a free one for you in Ribbon Candy Hooking, also in Rug Hooking and Punch Needle Club. If you're looking to hook something patriotic on the day, you can download that and print it. Be hooking that. We're going to be looking at the bald eagle. We're going to be looking at the mysterious origins of the American flag and that whole conversation about what that should look like. The Continental Congress and all of that. So we have a few more symbols to look up. It looks like Woolly, I made a note to myself, Woolly Fox also seems to carry polyminic designs. At least I wrote that down. I'll have to double check that before Wednesday. So we have a few more subjects that have to do with symbols, patriotic symbols, and we'll do that on Wednesday. I will let you get back to your barbecues, setting up for tonight, fireworks, or wherever you're going. And I wish you all a really happy 4th of July. It is so much fun to celebrate, however you're celebrating, however you feel about the way the country is right now. I like talking about the history of the country because it reminds me of where we came from, right? So for me, that's the most exciting part to talk about. It's the safest part to talk about at this moment too. But I hope you all have a wonderful 4th of July. And we will pick this up. I don't want to waste the rest of the episode, but we're running way over. So we'll pick up the rest of the episode on Wednesday, and maybe I'll roll in a little bit more of polyminic, maybe even a little bit of these quilts, right, from this book, All Flags Flying. I will see you on Wednesday. Have a great day tomorrow. Be safe tonight. Be thoughtful. Remember the dogs and the older people in the neighborhood. If you're shooting off some crazy loud stuff, be thoughtful about everybody. And I will meet you back on Wednesday for coffee time, usual time, noon Eastern Standard Time. I will see you then. If you want me in the meantime, ribboncandyhooking@gmail.com.